The scent of linseed oil and aged mahogany was a comfort, a familiar embrace I'd cultivated over 2 decades. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate dance of sandpaper over veneer, now felt strangely restless, hovering above the packing crates that littered my small workshop. Each tool, each bottle of solvent, each scrap of archival documentation had been meticulously wrapped, labeled, and inventoried. That was my way. Order. Precision. A quiet, unwavering dedication to bringing forgotten beauty back to life. It was a solitary existence, yes, but one I'd chosen, one that suited me. People rarely understood the profound satisfaction of coaxing the soul out of a forgotten chest or a tarnished portrait frame. But now, the familiar comfort was dissolving, replaced by an unsettling tremor. The inheritance. A distant relative I'd barely known, a name plucked from the farthest branches of a brittle family tree, had left me a manor house. Not just any manor, mind you. Blackwood Manor, the solicitor had called it, with a tone that suggested a polite cough was in order. Isolated, crumbling, and situated so far off the beaten track that my GPS had thrown up its digital hands in surrender an hour before I even saw the wrought iron gates. The drive itself had been a slow descent into a different kind of quiet. The kind where the only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath my tires and the distant, almost mournful sigh of the wind through ancient pines. No chirping birds, no hum of distant traffic, just an oppressive stillness that pressed in from all sides. The trees, thick and gnarled, formed a tunnel that seemed to swallow the last vestiges of daylight, even though it was only mid-afternoon. Then, through a break in the foliage, it loomed. Blackwood Manor. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, in a way that felt less about years and more about a deep, ingrained weariness. The stone facade, once grand, was now a tapestry of moss and creeping ivy, like a shroud slowly reclaiming its rightful place. Windows, hundreds of them it seemed, stared out like vacant eyes, some shattered, others opaque with grime, reflecting nothing but the gray, indifferent sky. A portion of the roof had caved in, a gaping maw against the skyline, and a chimney stack leaned at an alarming angle, threatening to disgorge its brick intestines at any moment. It was less a house and more a monument to decay, a testament to long-forgotten lives and unchecked entropy. A shiver, not entirely due to the biting autumn air, traced a path down my spine. I killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, a thick, palpable presence. I sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. This wasn't a restoration project, this was an archaeological dig into the heart of a ruin. My professional curiosity, usually a blazing fire, felt like a flickering match in a gale. There was something else here, too, something beyond the crumbling mortar and peeling paint. Oh wait. A palpable sense of expectation, as if the very air held its breath, waiting. Finally, I pushed open the car door. The hinges groaned, a sound that echoed unnaturally loud in the profound silence. I pulled my worn tweed jacket tighter. The massive oak front door, studded with black iron, hung slightly ajar, as if inviting, or perhaps daring, me to enter. I pushed it open further. The groan was louder this time, a drawn-out sigh. Inside, the gloom was absolute, broken only by weak shafts of light filtering through the grimy windows of the cavernous entrance hall. Dust motes danced in these slender beams, like tiny, forgotten souls. The air was thick, heavy, carrying that same unsettling mix of damp earth and something else. Something faintly metallic, like old blood, or perhaps just very old iron. My footsteps echoed on the flagstone floor, each one sounding unnaturally loud, swallowed quickly by the vastness of the space. I ran a hand over a nearby newel post. My restorer's instinct began to kick in, overriding, for a moment, the rising unease. I needed light. It revealed the grandeur that once was: soaring ceilings, faded tapestries hanging in tatters, a sweeping staircase that disappeared into the upper reaches like a phantom limb. Every surface was coated in a thick, velvety layer of dust, untouched for decades, perhaps longer. It felt less like a home and more like a tomb. I moved deeper, my beam dancing across peeling wallpaper and cobweb-draped chandeliers. A child's rocking horse, overturned in a forgotten nursery. A grand piano, its keys yellowed and silent, draped like a corpse under a sheet of dust. The sheer scale of the manor was overwhelming, a labyrinth of forgotten spaces. Then I saw it. Tucked away down a narrow, unusually low-ceilinged corridor off what must have once been the servants' quarters, was a section of wall that didn't quite belong. The stone here was a different shade, a slightly rougher cut, and the mortar lines were too uniform, too new, compared to the centuries-old craftsmanship around it. My fingers, almost unconsciously, reached out, testing the surface. Curiosity, the persistent, nagging kind that drives my profession, pulled me closer. I swept the flashlight beam over it again, noticing a faint vertical seam, almost invisible beneath the grime. It wasn't a wall, it was a door, expertly concealed. My heart gave a little lurch. A hidden passage? A secret room? My mind, the restorer's mind, thrilled at the prospect of uncovering a forgotten architectural detail. With newfound determination, I worked at the edges, my fingernails scraping against plaster and old sealant. I pressed harder, found a purchase, and with a grunt, pulled. The section of wall, surprisingly light, swung inward with a soft, dry rasp, revealing a narrow, utterly black opening. My flashlight beam pierced the gloom, revealing a short, cramped passage, barely wide enough for my shoulders. But the allure of the unknown, the professional compulsion to uncover, was stronger. I took a deep breath, the stale, cold air filling my lungs, and stepped into the darkness. The passage opened into a long, narrow corridor, entirely devoid of windows, lit only by my bobbing flashlight. And then, I saw the signs. Faint, faded, stenciled onto the stone walls at regular intervals, were numbers. I forced myself to move closer, my boots crunching softly on the loose earth. The beam steadied on the plaque. The words seemed to hang in the frigid air, heavy with a silent, terrible history. This wasn't a hidden architectural quirk. This was something else entirely. The metallic tang in the air suddenly made sense. It wasn't just rust. It was the scent of confinement, of despair, of something unspeakably old and profoundly wrong. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a deliberate, suffocating quiet, as if sound itself had been banished, forbidden to exist. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to turn and run, to seal the passage and pretend I had never found it. But my feet, heavy as stone, refused to move. The metallic tang, the one I dismissed as mere rust, clung to the back of my throat, a phantom taste of something far more sinister. The discovery of that phrase, "Old Death Row Corridor Marked for Closure," had driven a cold spike into the uneasy calm I tried to cultivate within the manor. It wasn't just a structural oddity. It was a scar, a history of suffering etched into the very bones of the house, and the implications of closure were chilling. I spent the next morning trying to rationalize it away, poring over architectural plans I'd found in a dusty roll in the library. Nothing. The plans depicted a grand, if slightly eccentric, residence, built for comfort and display. The discrepancy gnawed me, a discordant note in the symphony of my restoration plans. But I was Reed, and my nature was to fix, to restore, to bring order to decay. I needed to work. I chose the main drawing room first, a cavernous space choked with cobwebs and draped in sheets that had long since surrendered their pristine white to a pervasive gray. It was a project that demanded focus, a tangible battle against entropy. My tools, meticulously organized in their wooden chest, represented control. My workbench, set up near a vast, grimy window overlooking a tangle of overgrown gardens, was my sanctuary. I laid out my small chisels, my fine-grit sandpaper, my pots of shellac. I picked up a delicate brass key, intending to try and release the pendulum. When I looked back to my workbench, the key was gone. My brow furrowed. I hadn't moved. I hadn't even blinked. I scanned the immediate area, the cleared patch of floorboards, the surface of the clock. A flicker of annoyance, then I dismissed it. Fatigue. The journey, the unsettling discoveries. My mind was playing tricks. I rummaged in my tool chest for a replacement, grumbling under my breath. As I straightened up, the original brass key lay precisely where I had first placed it, nestled beside a small pot of polishing compound. A prickle crawled up my neck. I stared at the key, then at the empty space in the chest where I'd just rummaged. My hands were steady, my mind, usually a precise instrument, felt hazy at the edges. I shook my head, a sharp, deliberate movement. The house was vast, old, prone to echoes and optical illusions. That was all. I immersed myself in the clock's inner workings, the delicate dance of springs and cogs. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light outside the window. I worked until my fingers ached and the smell of aged brass and linseed oil filled the air. Then, a sound. A faint, almost imperceptible thump from somewhere above me. I paused, my hand hovering over a miniature screw. The house was silent again, save for the distant murmur of the wind through broken panes upstairs. I strained my ears, waiting. Just the vast, empty quiet. It was too easy to imagine things in such a place, I told myself. The timbers settling. A loose shudder. Later, as twilight began to bleed the colors from the room, I found myself needing a specific type of wood glue from a box I'd left in the kitchen. I retrieved the glue. The door, which I had firmly shut and even tested the latch on that morning, was now ajar. I stopped dead, my heart giving a sudden, unpleasant lurch. I remembered the metallic tang, the feeling of despair. Had I really closed it? I was meticulous. My memory, usually ironclad, felt wobbly. I approached the door slowly, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy brass knob. Something like damp earth and old, dried blood. My mind rebelled against the latter, dismissing it as suggestion. I pushed the door open fully. The antechamber beyond was as I remembered it, shrouded in gloom, leading to the deeper, unsettling passages. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. Yet, the distinct impression of being watched settled upon me, heavy and undeniable, like a shroud. It wasn't just the house I felt watching me now, it was something in it. Something that had been waiting. and it had noticed I was here. It wasn't just the words, it was the chilling precision of them, the implication of a history far grimmer than mere neglect. My restorer's mind, however, wouldn't let go. It latched onto inconsistencies, discrepancies, and the faint, almost imperceptible shifts in the manor's architecture. My work, usually a source of meditative focus, became an obsessive quest. I moved through the echoing halls with a new, heightened awareness, my tools no longer just instruments of restoration but extensions of my probing curiosity. The next few days blurred into a relentless cycle of scraping, sanding, and searching. It was a section of the manor that felt different. The walls, despite my best efforts to clean them, seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. My fingers, calloused from years of intricate work, traced the rough plaster. I tapped, listened, felt for variations in vibration, the way a blind person reads a landscape through touch. And then I found it. A subtle unevenness, a minute shift in the grain of the plaster, almost imperceptible to the eye, but undeniable to my fingertips. It was along what appeared to be a structural seam, a place where two large sections of wall met. But something felt wrong. The seam didn't quite align with the overall architectural flow of the building. It was an anomaly. My heart gave a slow, heavy thump against my ribs. This was it. This was the rabbit hole. I fetched my finer tools, a small, sharp chisel, a mallet, and a pair of magnifying goggles. The work was painstaking, delicate. I didn't want to damage whatever lay beneath, but I also needed to be methodical. Each tap of the mallet sent a faint tremor through the ancient stone, a vibration that seemed to echo not just in the walls, but deep within my own bones. Dust, thick and gray, billowed around me, catching the weak beam of my headlamp. It smelled of pulverized lime and something else, something vaguely acrid, like dried blood and iron. That phantom metallic taste returned, sharper this time. After an hour of careful excavation, a thin line appeared. Not a crack, but a deliberate cut, expertly concealed. It ran vertically, then horizontally, outlining a hidden panel. My breath hitched. With renewed determination, I widened the gaps, prying away chunks of ancient plaster. It wasn't the usual oak or pine I'd found elsewhere in the manor. Finally, with a soft thud, the panel gave way. The walls were rough-hewn stone, devoid of plaster, and the floor was damp earth. In the center of this small, forgotten room, resting on a crude wooden pedestal, was a single, peculiar object. Its surface was intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize, swirling lines, sharp angles, and what looked like stylized human eyes. The wood felt unnervingly warm to the touch, almost alive. I carefully lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of brittle, yellowed linen, was not a journal, but a collection of small, crudely fashioned clay tablets. Each tablet bore similar carvings to the box, but also rows of etched, repetitive patterns. They weren't letters, not in any language I knew, but they exuded an unsettling sense of purpose, a coded record. As I picked one up, a fine layer of dust coated my fingers. My gaze fell upon a particular sequence of symbols on one tablet, a repeated pattern that seemed to pulse with an unholy rhythm. I focused, trying to decipher it, when suddenly, a strange sensation washed over me. It started subtly, like a forgotten word hovering just out of reach. I was trying to remember the name of the previous owner, the one who'd signed the final sale documents. It wasn't important, not really, but the blank space where the name should have been felt. Wrong. I knew it, I'd read it 100 times, but it was just gone. Then, a flicker. A brief, disorienting moment where I couldn't quite recall what I was doing, or why I was standing in a dusty, hidden room holding a strange clay tablet. Who was I? Read. Yes, read. The feeling passed as quickly as it came, leaving me breathless and shaken. I blinked, rubbing my temples. Stress, I told myself, my mind working overtime, the isolation getting to me. This manor, this endless work, it was all taking its toll. I looked down at the clay tablet in my hand, the strange symbols now seeming to shift and writhe in the weak light. The memory lapse had been brief, insignificant perhaps, but it had left an indelible mark. It echoed in my head, a discordant note in the quiet hum of the old house. What did it mean? And why was it etched into a beam in this forgotten, decaying wing? The tools lay untouched, the half-sanded banister forgotten. My mind churned, a frantic search engine trying to connect disparate pieces of information. I needed answers. I needed to understand what history this manor truly held, beyond the dusty ledgers and architectural blueprints. I dedicated the next few days to digging. My laptop became an extension of my arm, its screen a window into the past. I scoured online archives, digitized local newspapers, and obscure historical society forums. I cross-referenced property deeds, census records, and even old obituaries. The search was frustratingly vague at first, a patchwork of incomplete narratives. The manor, it seemed, had always been shrouded in a peculiar silence, a reluctance from official records to fully document its past. But patterns began to emerge. Mentions of unexplained departures of staff, sudden changes in ownership due to unfortunate circumstances, and vague references to periods of ill health among residents. One particularly unsettling article from 1897 detailed the disappearance of a young groundskeeper, simply vanished, leaving behind only his gardening shears and a half-eaten lunch. Another, a decade later, spoke of a wealthy industrialist who, after acquiring the manor, began to exhibit marked eccentricities, ultimately selling the property at a significant loss and retreating from public life entirely. The common thread was a sense of something being lost here, not just property or people, but something more intangible. Sanity. Memory. The research became a blur, hours bleeding into each other. I'd fall asleep at my desk, the glow of the screen still imprinted on my eyelids. That's when the nightmares started. Not the usual anxieties of a restorer, but something far more visceral. I was always in the manor, but it was twisted, warped. The walls would breathe, the floorboards undulate like a living thing. They spoke of names I didn't recognize, events I couldn't grasp, all laced with a profound, suffocating sorrow. Then, a single, sharp sound cut through the cacophony, the unmistakable clang of a heavy door slamming shut, echoing down the corridor. I woke with a gasp, my chest heaving, the metallic taste coating my tongue as if I'd just bitten down on a copper penny. The waking hours offered little respite. I started seeing things. A flicker of movement in a dusty mirror that resolved into nothing but my own tired reflection. The manor itself seemed to shift. I'd walk into a room, convinced I'd just seen a new crack in the plaster, only for it to be gone a moment later. Or a familiar carving on a mantelpiece would appear subtly altered, its lines sharper, its expression more menacing. I'd blink, rub my eyes, and it would return to its original form. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself, a byproduct of exhaustion and stress. Then came the memory gaps. Small at first, innocuous. I'd set down my wrench, turn to grab a rag, and completely forget where I'd placed it. I'd walk into a room, the purpose of my journey completely erased from my mind. But they grew more significant, more alarming. One afternoon, I was meticulously sanding a wooden panel, completely engrossed in the rhythmic motion. I looked up, saw the clock, and realized an entire hour had simply vanished. I had no recollection of the last 60 minutes. My hands were still working, but my mind was blank. It was as if a segment of my consciousness had been snipped away, leaving a smooth, empty space. Panic began to coil in my gut. I tried to retrace my steps, to reconstruct the missing time, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. Was this what happened to the industrialist? Did the manor simply take pieces of you? I found a particularly unsettling entry in an old, brittle diary I'd unearthed in the library. It belonged to a former housekeeper from the early 1900s. Her handwriting, initially neat and precise, became increasingly erratic, her entries fragmented. "The house hungers," one scrawled line read. "It eats the thoughts, the moments. Soon, there will be nothing left but the shell." The last few pages were nothing but nonsensical scribbles, looping lines and repeated, meaningless words. The phrase echoed in my mind, drawing me back to that forgotten wing. The air was heavy, stagnant, yet it hummed with an unseen energy. They were faint, desperate pleas, a chorus of forgotten voices. My determination, once a steady flame, now flickered like a candle in a gale. Each discovery, each forgotten moment, each hallucination, chipped away at my certainty. I was Reed, the restorer, the meticulous craftsman. But the lines were blurring. The manor was no longer just a project, it was an adversary, and it was winning. I could feel my grip on reality loosening, the edges fraying. And I was becoming its meal. Coppery and deep, as if the air itself had been steeped in ancient, unspilled iron. It wasn't just words on a page, it was a cold, certain presence, a chill that seeped not from the drafts, but from the very marrow of the manor. My hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as I ran them over the rough plaster of the wall beside the hidden doorway. This wasn't a hidden pantry or a forgotten servant's passage. The air in this part of the house, a neglected wing I'd barely touched, felt heavier, almost viscous. It muffled the distant creaks of the house settling, turning them into dull thuds, as if the sound itself had to fight to reach me. I retrieved my powerful work lamp from my toolkit, the beam cutting a stark, almost surgical swath through the gloom. The hinges of the hidden door groaned, a long, drawn-out complaint that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up into my bones. The sound was too organic, too mournful for mere metal and wood. It was a sigh. I pushed the door inward, bracing myself, not for cobwebs or dust, but for the weight of whatever lay beyond. And there it was. It wasn't what I expected. No cells, no bars, not in the traditional sense. Instead, it was a long, narrow passage, barely wider than my shoulders, lined with what looked like thick, dark timber panels. These weren't decorative, they were functional, heavy, almost brutally plain. Every few feet, a vertical seam suggested a former opening, now sealed. The floor was rough-hewn stone, slick with a perpetual dampness, and the air here was thick with the smell of wet earth, mildew, and that persistent, sickening metallic tang. It seemed to stretch into an impossible distance, the perspective warping slightly at the far end, as if the light itself struggled to penetrate its depths. The paneling on either side began to play tricks on my eyes. I stopped, forcing myself to stare, to rationalize. It was old wood, warped by time and moisture. That was all. But the rational explanation felt thin, fragile, a flimsy shield against the growing unease. It wasn't a word, just a sibilant hiss, a breath of sound that raised the hairs on my arms. My own breath, quick and shallow, sounded deafening in my ears. I took another step, then another. And then I saw it, or thought I did. A shape, vaguely human, but indistinct, like smoke. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing, only the unending, dark corridor. Hello? My voice was a croak, swallowed almost immediately. The sound was alien, not my own. It felt wrong, like a stranger had spoken. A sudden, sharp memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid, the exact shade of turquoise on the wallpaper in my childhood bedroom. But it wasn't turquoise, it was a pale, sickly green. No, it was turquoise. I paused, frowning, trying to reconcile the conflicting images. My childhood bedroom had been turquoise. Hadn't it? The metallic tang in the air intensified, acrid and suffocating. It felt like I was breathing in rusted blood. The timber panels lining the corridor seemed to press in, narrowing the passage. The illusion was so strong, so visceral, I had to physically stretch out my hands to confirm the distance. It was real. The walls were closer. This wasn't just my imagination. This was happening. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the wooden panels, seeping from the stone floor. One voice, however, cut through the din, clearer than the others, and it sounded exactly like my own. Nothing. No one. The corridor began to undulate, the floor pitching, the walls swaying. I stumbled, catching myself on a rough panel. My fingers clenched, digging into the wood, and I felt something splinter beneath my grip. Then, the faces. They appeared in the grain of the wood panels, fleeting, ghostly visages, each one distinct, yet all bearing a terrible, shared expression of despair and agony. And then, one face emerged, clearer than the rest, its features sharpening, coalescing from the knots and lines of the timber. It was my face. My mouth, distorted in a silent scream. "This isn't your home, Reed." The voice, my voice, echoed from the walls, from the floor, from inside my own skull. "You have no home. You have no self." My sense of self, that bedrock of my existence, began to crumble. My name. Reed. Was that right? Why did it feel foreign? My profession, antique restorer. The meticulous work, the quiet satisfaction. The memories, the vibrant details of my life, began to fray at the edges, like old photographs left too long in the sun. Colors faded, faces blurred, events became distant, hazy echoes. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to hold my thoughts together, to anchor myself. Who are you, Reed? Who are you, really? The question hammered at me, not just from the outside, but from within, a corrosive doubt eating at the very core of my being. I couldn't answer. I felt myself slipping, dissolving into the metallic air, becoming just another faceless whisper in the endless, dark corridor. A sudden, jarring sound cut through the cacophony, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping. I stood there, trembling, utterly disoriented, my hands still pressed against my head, no longer knowing where the walls were, or even who I was. The metallic taste still clung to my tongue, a phantom residue of the air itself, and the question echoed, not in my ears, but in the hollow space where my answers used to reside. "Who are you?" I couldn't say. The words formed on my lips, but the meaning evaporated, like breath on a cold pane. My name, my past, the intricate tapestry of my identity, it was all fraying, threads snapping one by one, leaving gaping holes. A desperate, unreasoning need to get out. This place, this house, it was doing this to me. It was a disease, a slow, insidious poison, and the only cure was escape. I stumbled through the grand hall, the polished floorboards a dizzying blur beneath my feet. Now, it looked like a tombstone. It turned with a groan, but the door wouldn't budge. I pushed, then pulled, grunting with effort, my shoulders straining. It was as if the house itself had sealed its lips, refusing to open. No click of a lock, no sound of a deadbolt sliding home, just an immovable, silent resistance. I tried again, harder, throwing my weight against it until my shoulder ached. Nothing. The door stood impassive, a mocking barrier. My breath hitched in my throat. I backed away, my gaze darting around the hall, searching for another exit. The tall windows, usually letting in generous light, now appeared opaque, their panes reflecting my own distorted face back at me like funhouse mirrors. I tried one, rapping on the glass with my knuckles. The sound was flat, dead, absorbed by the thick, ancient glass. It felt unnaturally solid, unyielding. I couldn't even discern the latch. My phone. My lifeline. Where was it? I patted my pockets, a frantic search. I pulled it out, staring at the screen. A single, blinking icon, no service. And the battery indicator was a sliver of red, already dying. I jabbed at the power button, willing it to life, willing it to find a signal, willing it to let me call someone, anyone. But who would I call? A colleague? A relative? The faces, the names, they flickered at the edges of my awareness, like half-forgotten dreams. The memory of their purpose, their connection to me, was just out of reach. The phone died in my hand, the screen going black, leaving me staring at my own terrified reflection again. A rising tide of helplessness threatened to engulf me. This wasn't just physical resistance, it was a psychological siege. My memory was the first casualty, now my means of communication, my very ability to connect with the outside world. The entity wasn't just in the house, it was the house, twisting it, bending it to its will. I wandered deeper, propelled by a desperate, aimless energy. I pushed through a side door I vaguely remembered led to the old servants' quarters, a rarely used section of the manor I hadn't yet begun to restore. The corridor stretched before me, not as I remembered it. The walls were no longer peeling wallpaper and faded paint. The ceiling was low, pressing down, making the air feel even heavier. On either side, heavy, riveted steel doors were set into the concrete, each with a small, barred slit at eye level. They were uniformly spaced, a grim, repetitive sequence. This wasn't part of the manor. This was impossible. I knew every inch of this house, or I thought I did. I peered through the narrow slit, but saw only inky blackness. A faint, cloying sweetness, like decaying flowers and stale sweat, wafted from within. My eyes followed the line of the corridor, the flickering lights making the far end disappear into an impenetrable gloom. How could this be here? Was I dreaming? Was this another trick of my failing mind? I kept walking, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud on the concrete floor. Each cell door I passed was identical, each slid a window into nothingness. Then, I saw something different. Not words, not a symbol, but a series of overlapping, indistinct faces, crudely drawn, their features blurred as if by erasure. They weren't smiling, weren't grimacing. They were simply there, a collection of forgotten visages, their identities slowly fading even on the wall itself. And then I understood, with a sickening lurch in my gut. This corridor, this place of finality, of forgotten lives, was a manifestation. The entity wasn't just eroding my memory, it had done this before. It fed on identity, on the very essence of personhood, leaving behind only these spectral imprints, these blank canvases where faces once were. This wasn't just a house, it was a mausoleum of forgotten selves, and I was merely its latest acquisition. I was trapped, not just by walls and locked doors, but by something that consumed the very substance of who I was, leaving me to wander this internal prison until I, too, became just another blurred face on a forgotten wall. Who are you? I couldn't say. The sound was there, a ghost of a syllable, then gone. I pushed through it, a desperate swimmer breaking the surface. There had to be something, some anchor, some truth. The designation was etched into a corroded brass plaque beside a heavy, rusted iron door. Inside, the corridor stretched, narrow and grim, lined with cells on either side. Each cell door was a lattice of heavy bars, some twisted, others hanging ajar, groaning on their hinges. No dust motes danced, even the light from the single, flickering bulb far down the hall seemed to struggle, barely piercing the gloom. The silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a watchful, hungry entity in itself. Not names, but symbols, glyphs that writhed and bled into each other, like a language trying to escape itself. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but a chorus of them, overlapping, vying for my attention. The first. The giving. A jolt coursed through me, a memory, not my own, but a vision of a man, his face gaunt, kneeling before an altar of rough stones in a cavern far beneath this very spot. He was offering something, not an animal, but an intricate carving, a vessel of memory, intricately wrought from bone. It wasn't a physical act, but a consumption of essence. It takes. It feeds. The self. On the far wall, illuminated by the struggling light, were more carvings, more glyphs. But these were crude, desperate, scratched with fingernails into the stone. The entity wasn't merely in the manor, it was bound to this place, deeper than the foundations. It was ancient, a primal hunger that had existed long before any stones were laid. It didn't just take memories, it consumed them, devoured the very fibers of identity, leaving behind an empty husk, a blank slate. And then, it began to fill that slate, not with its own thoughts, but with fragments of the consumed, twisted and rearranged, to create a manufactured reality, a living delusion for its victims. The spirals on the wall weren't just a drawing, they were a map of the process. And then, the insidious part, the entity didn't just kill, it replaced. It wanted to live through its victims, to experience the world through their stolen senses, their borrowed consciousness, forever shifting, forever new. It craved the freshness of a mind, the unique tapestry of a life, only to unravel it and weave its own grotesque imitation. My name, the one I couldn't recall, wasn't just lost, it was taken. My past wasn't forgotten, it was being meticulously dismantled, piece by piece, to make room for something else. I wasn't just losing myself, I was being overwritten. A vessel. A willing heart. A new beginning. The ultimate cost was not merely death, nor even madness. It was an active, conscious surrender. The entity demanded that its victim, in their final moments of clarity, choose to become the conduit, to open the door, to offer their remaining self as the final, perfect meal. It wasn't satisfied with a struggle, it wanted a willing sacrifice, a conscious descent into oblivion, leaving behind a perfectly preserved shell, inhabited by its ancient, parasitic will. It fed not just on memory, but on the act of relinquishment. My own body, my own mind, was becoming the battlefield. I was being prepared. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. The determination, however, a stubborn ember in the encroaching gloom, flickered. I might be losing my identity, but I now knew the enemy. The question wasn't who I was, but what I would choose to be. The air in the manor pressed in on me, thick and cloying like wet wool. It wasn't just the dust or the damp, it was the entity itself, a palpable weight against the inside of my skull, a cold hand reaching for the last scraps of who I was. My memories were a tattered quilt, threads snapping, colors fading. Faces blurred. Names vanished. But in the wreckage of my mind, a single, jagged shard of clarity remained. A terrible, burning conviction. I understood now. The ultimate cost wasn't just death, nor even madness. It was an active, conscious surrender. It wasn't satisfied with anything less than a willing, perfect sacrifice. That was the chilling truth that had clawed its way to the surface of my consciousness, a revelation that both terrified and galvanized me. It wanted me to choose. Very well. I would choose. But my choice wouldn't be the one it expected. My hands, though shaky, still remembered the meticulous dance of restoration. They moved with an instinct that bypassed my fractured thoughts, searching through the forgotten nooks of the manor. I wasn't looking for a weapon, not in the traditional sense. I was looking for a way to corrupt the sacrifice, to turn the offering into poison. My mind, a fractured mirror, kept flashing images, a faded drawing I'd uncovered beneath a crumbling plaster frieze, depicting a figure ensnared in thorny vines, a brittle, leather-bound journal entry from one of the manor's long-dead occupants, detailing a binding ritual that sounded more like a desperate plea than a prayer. It wasn't about fighting the thing, I realized. It was about containing it. Making myself a cage, not a feast. Give in. It will be over. But I clung to that sliver of clarity, that desperate, defiant spark. My essence was eroding, yes, but the will to resist, despite it, to make my end mean something, was hardening into a diamond-hard resolve. I would offer myself, but I would be an indigestible meal, a trap sprung from the inside. But as my memories frayed, other, deeper impressions surfaced. The cellar wasn't just a cellar. It had been sealed, not merely forgotten. My breath plumed in the frigid air. The descent was a spiral into the manor's buried past, a journey into its deepest, most sinister foundations. The wooden stairs gave way to rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture. The walls narrowed, pressing in on me, their surfaces scored with ancient, meaningless symbols and the faint, ghostly outlines of names long forgotten. This was not a place built for storage. This was a place for holding, for containing. A heavy, iron-bound door, half-rotted, leaning precariously on rusted hinges. Beyond it, a narrow, unforgiving passage stretched into absolute gloom. It wasn't just a corridor, it was a tomb, a forgotten prison beneath the earth, a testament to some ancient, brutal justice enacted in these very foundations. I would present myself, my conscious choice, but I would anchor myself to a single, inviolable truth, a memory so potent, so deeply ingrained, that it would act as a kind of psychic shackle. It wouldn't be a happy memory, those were too fragile now. It would be the memory of defiance, of resistance, of the sheer, bloody-minded refusal to be utterly consumed. I would become the entity's ultimate paradox, a willing surrender that was, in its deepest core, an act of ultimate rebellion. The entity's presence was a palpable hum now, vibrating through the very stone beneath my feet. It knew I was here. It knew what I intended, or at least, it sensed the profound shift in my will. I stepped into the corridor, the iron door groaning shut behind me with a sound like a dying sigh. The walls were rough, cold stone, smelling of decay and iron. I ran a hand over the surface, feeling the damp, the grit, the faint, desperate etchings of those who had passed through here before. They were just names, dates, desperate prayers. They were echoes of lives that had ended in this very place. And now, so would mine. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the air stale and heavy in my lungs. My identity was a fractured thing, a mosaic shattered on stone, but the shards still held a purpose. I would offer them, not as a gift, but as a weapon. I would become the cage, and this forgotten corridor, marked for closure, would be the final, terrifying chamber. The entity was here, all around me, in the very air I breathed. It was time. Fading. But I wouldn't let them go. Not now. Not when I was so close. I clutched the small, meticulously carved wooden box to my chest, its smooth, polished surface a cool anchor against my clammy shirt. It was a piece I'd spent weeks on, sanding, oiling, coaxing the intricate patterns back from the brink of decay. A fragment of myself, poured into its grain. It was my last tether. My breath hitched, ragged and shallow, as I navigated the winding passages leading to the manor's forgotten depths. Reed, a voice, thin and reedy, echoed from nowhere and everywhere. It sounded like my own voice, but warped, like an old record skipping. Reed is gone. I am Reed. The path narrowed, the ceiling lowering until I had to duck, my shoulders brushing against crumbling stone. Then, the walls gave way to a long, straight passage, the very air vibrating with a malevolent hum. The corridor stretched ahead, impossibly long and suffocatingly narrow. Peeling paint hung in leprous strips from the walls, revealing the rough-hewn stone beneath. On either side, heavy iron doors, rusted solid, were set into the walls, each with a small, grimy viewport like a vacant eye. This was its lair, its feeding ground. The place where despair had once been so concentrated, it had ripped a hole in the fabric of existence, allowing this thing to seep through. I could feel it now, pressing against the inside of my eyeballs, a searing pressure that threatened to crack my skull. Foolish. There is nothing left for you here. My vision blurred. A flash, my mother's face, smiling, then dissolving into a featureless mask. Another flash, my workshop, tools laid out, then the room crumbling to dust. No. Not my memories. Not my craft. I gripped the wooden box tighter, knuckles white. My plan. It had to work. I stumbled forward, my legs feeling like lead, drawn by an unseen force towards the very end of the corridor, where the light, what little there was, seemed to coalesce into a sickly, pulsing glow. As I reached the end, I saw it. It was formless, yet utterly present, a gaping maw in reality. "Give it to me," it hissed, the sound like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. "Give me the last of Reed. Become empty. Become me. Dot." My hands trembled, but I forced them steady. I lifted the wooden box. "No," I croaked, my voice thin but resolute. "You don't get it. You don't get me. Dot." The entity pulsed, a wave of pure psychic force slamming into me. My knees buckled. Memories flashed, a chaotic, agonizing montage, my first broken toy, a forgotten birthday, a harsh word from a long-dead relative. These weren't just memories, they were feelings, raw and agonizing, stripped bare. But then, a different memory surfaced, clear and sharp amidst the chaos, the day I first restored a piece of furniture, a battered old chest, and saw its true beauty emerge from the grime. The satisfaction, the sense of purpose, the knowledge that I had brought something back from oblivion. This was the core of Reed. Not just the memories, but the act of restoration itself. The belief that things could be made whole again. And then, the reveal hit me, a sudden, blinding clarity amidst the psychic assault. The entity had thrived here because nothing was restored. Nothing was remembered with care. Everything was simply left to rot. My plan wasn't just to anchor myself, it was to restore something here, to create an act of preservation in the heart of its decay. With a defiant roar that tore from my chest, I gripped the wooden box and slammed it onto the grimy floor at the heart of the swirling vortex. The impact sent a shockwave through the corridor. The box, polished and pristine, stood out against the filth, a beacon of purpose. The entity shrieked, a sound that ripped through my ears, threatening to tear my eardrums. It hated the act of creation, the presence of something meticulously cared for. I stood, swaying, my head throbbing, but a fierce determination ignited within me. "You feed on what's lost," I gasped, clutching my temples. "But I bring things back. I remember." Dot. The vortex pulsed, trying to consume the box, but the polished wood seemed to hum with a quiet resistance. The intricate carvings, each line I had painstakingly restored, seemed to glow faintly. My memories, previously a tattered quilt, began to knit back together, not perfectly, but with renewed strength, like patched fabric. The image of my mother's face, my workshop, my hands working, they were mine again. The battle wasn't over. The entity writhed, its hunger still palpable, but it was wounded, pushed back by the sheer defiance of a single act of restoration. I had found its weakness. I had found my own strength. The fight for Reed, for me, had just begun. The vortex shrieked its last, a sound like tearing fabric, not just of air but of reality itself. Then, nothing. Just the ringing silence, a heavier, thicker quiet than I'd ever known. My hands still clamped around the polished box, its intricate carvings now cool against my palms. The faint glow was gone, replaced by the dull sheen of aged wood. My muscles screamed, my entire body trembling with an exhaustion that went beyond physical strain. I collapsed onto the dust-laden floor, the box clattering beside me. My memories. The tattered quilt. It had knitted back together, but not perfectly. Not whole. like a garment mended with the wrong threads, leaving strange, mismatched patches. I could recall my name, Reed. My profession, antique restorer. The manor. The inheritance. These anchor points felt solid, thank God. But the details around them. They were hazy, fragmented. Faces of former colleagues, names of past projects, even the layout of rooms in the manor I'd spent months meticulously restoring, they flickered like faulty lamps. The silence in the room was oppressive, not a peaceful quiet, but a vacuum left by something immense being ripped away. I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy, my head throbbing with a dull ache. But there was nothing. Just the familiar, decaying grandeur of the manor's central hall, now feeling utterly alien. I stumbled, trying to find my bearings. The manor, though, seemed to stretch and warp around me. Stone walls, damp and sweating, closed in. The passage opened abruptly, not into another room of the manor, but into a long, grim corridor. Fluorescent lights, flickering erratically, hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on chipped concrete walls. A series of heavy, bolted doors lined one side, each with a small, grimy window, like an eye peering out of a tomb. My breath hitched. Death row. This wasn't the manor. It couldn't be. My mind reeled. Had I imagined the manor? Was this the truth? No, the box in my hand, the tingling in my fingertips, the phantom ache of the entity's presence, that was real. The manor was real. But how had I gotten here? And why did this place feel so familiar, yet utterly unknown? Nothing. A blank. A gaping chasm where memories should have been. It was like trying to grasp smoke. All gone. Replaced by a vague, unsettling impression of decay. I walked slowly down the corridor, the soles of my shoes echoing unnervingly on the concrete. Each step was a struggle. My gaze fixed on the bolted doors. A faint scratching sound reached my ears, thin and persistent, from behind one of the doors. It wasn't loud enough to be a rat. It was too regular, too deliberate. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Pause. Like fingernails dragging across stone. My heart, which I hadn't realized had quieted, began to thump an erratic rhythm against my ribs. I stopped at the next door. This window was less grimy. I leaned in, my breath fogging the glass. There was a cot, a toilet, and a figure. Hunched in the corner, facing away from me. Small, shrunken. It was just an impression, a silhouette against the deeper gloom, but a wave of nausea washed over me. The figure was scratching at the wall with a shard of something, leaving faint, erratic marks. And as I watched, it slowly, deliberately, turned its head. It was me. Or what was left of me. The face was gaunt, eyes wide and unfocused, hair matted. It was wearing clothes that looked like rags, clothes I vaguely recognized as my own, but torn and stained. Its lips moved, silently, ceaselessly. And as its empty gaze met mine through the grimy window, a single, horrifying thought solidified in my shattered mind: this wasn't a memory. This wasn't a delusion. This was another me. A fragment. A discarded piece. The entity hadn't just taken my memories. It had shredded me, scattered the pieces, and left me to wander through its broken remnants. The victory, if it could be called that, was a Pyrrhic one. I had contained the entity, perhaps, but at what cost? My identity was a mosaic of broken glass, some pieces missing, others distorted, and some, like the thing staring back at me from behind the bolted door, left to rot in this forgotten corridor. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my own face, feeling the contours, the stubble, the weariness etched around my eyes. Was I real? Or was I just another discarded fragment, walking free for now, but destined to end up behind one of these doors? The scratching continued. Pause. And then, a low, guttural moan, a sound of profound, endless despair, emanating from the cell. It was my voice. I knew it. But it was a voice stripped of hope, of reason, of everything that made me read. I turned and ran, blindly, down the corridor, away from the echoing moan, away from the flickering lights and the bolted doors and the terrifying reflection of my own shattered self. The box, still clutched in my hand, felt like a lead weight. It was a weapon, a shield, a container. But it was also a reminder of what I had done, and what I had become. The manor, the entity, the restoration, it was all a blur, a horrifying tapestry woven with threads of truth and delusion, and I was lost within its folds, perhaps forever. The lingering scars weren't just on my mind, they were my mind. The ringing silence that followed the vortex's shriek was not empty. It pressed in, thick and heavy, like the air before a storm. My hand still clutched the polished box, its intricate carvings now cool, almost inert, against my palms. The faint glow, which had pulsed with such malevolent intent, had receded, leaving the wood dull and lifeless. I stood there, trembling, not from cold but from the sheer, sudden absence of the oppressive weight that had defined my existence for so long. It was over. I didn't look back. The car started on the first try, a small mercy. I didn't know where I was going, only that it had to be away. I landed in a city I'd never seen before, a sprawling, indifferent concrete beast miles from the quiet, suffocating embrace of the manor. I found a small flat, high up, with a window that looked out onto a bustling street. The constant hum of traffic, the distant wail of sirens, the murmur of countless voices, it was a cacophony, but it was life. It was real. I told myself it was real. For a time, I tried to rebuild. I sold the box, anonymously, to a small, private collector, not mentioning its true nature. I couldn't bear to keep it, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy something that had been so central to my twisted victory. I started taking on restoration projects again, small pieces, antique clocks, delicate porcelain. My hands, once so steady, trembled occasionally, but I chalked it up to lingering shock. The first hint that my victory was a cruel deception came subtly. I was working on a mahogany desk, tracing the faint scratches of decades of use. I found myself knowing, with an uncanny certainty, that the deepest gouge was made by a child's toy train, not a pen. I saw the flash of a small hand, the gleam of brass rails. It wasn't a guess, it was a memory, sharp and clear, but it wasn't mine. I shook my head, blaming fatigue. Then came the smells. A faint, cloying scent of damp earth and decaying paper in my immaculate flat. The musty perfume of ancient spices where I knew only the sterile tang of cleaning products should be. I'd search, compulsively, for the source, tearing apart cushions, sniffing at walls, but there was never anything. I started to notice things about myself. My reflection in the mirror seemed different. not physically, but in the eyes. There was a depth there, a stillness, that wasn't read. It was as if another layer, thin and transparent, had settled over my own identity. I'd find myself staring, trying to peel it back, but it clung. A few months into my new life, a peculiar opportunity arose. A massive, abandoned municipal building, slated for eventual demolition, was being temporarily leased out for various art and restoration projects. The pay was good, the work challenging, and it was a chance to finally feel productive again. I took it. The building was a labyrinth of forgotten offices, echoing chambers, and long-dead machinery. My assigned task was in a section that had once been a correctional facility, an area largely untouched by the other tenants. The moment I stepped into that corridor, a profound stillness descended. Overhead, bare bulbs cast a sickly yellow glow on chipped paint and rusted cell doors. I started my work, meticulously documenting the flaking paint, the etched graffiti from forgotten lives, the corroded metalwork. Each detail I touched, each surface I cleaned, brought with it a cascade of impressions. It wasn't empathy, it was absorption. I wasn't just observing history, I was drinking it in. And then, it happened. Not a memory of the manor, not a phantom smell. This was something else entirely. It wasn't a vision, it was a direct experience, as vivid and real as my own heartbeat. When it receded, I gasped, clutching my head. My own memories felt thin, brittle, like old parchment. But the man's fear, his final moments, those were etched into me, sharp and clear. And then I understood. The entity hadn't been destroyed. It hadn't been contained. It had merely found a new vessel. My victory had been its triumph. By confronting it, by taking its focus, the polished box, into my hands, I hadn't trapped it, I had become it. Or, rather, I had become its anchor, its new route in the world. I felt the hunger, a quiet, insistent thrum beneath my ribs. It wasn't a violent craving, but a deep, profound yearning to know, to absorb, to collect star. The memories of the forgotten, the echoes of lives lived and lost, they were all here, waiting. And I, Reed, the meticulous restorer, was now their inheritor. Their keeper. Their devourer. I reached the end of the corridor, the last cell door, and paused. My reflection in the grimy window of the door was still mine, outwardly. But the eyes. I wasn't Reed anymore, not entirely. I was a library of sorrows, a living archive of fading identities. And I felt, in the deepest, most unsettling part of my being, a strange, profound sense of belonging. This wasn't horror anymore. This was my new reality. And the hunger was growing.